There was one voice in rock that every singer feared being compared to. A voice so powerful, so emotional, so untouchable. The industry didn't call him a legend. They called him the Voice. And Jon Bon Jovi knew, if he wanted to rise, he'd have to step out from under that shadow. But what no one knew at the time is that Jon didn't just admire Steve Perry, he was chasing him. When Steve Perry's voice defined the era. Long before Jon Bon Jovi ever stepped onto a stadium stage, the world of rock already had its vocal benchmark, and that benchmark was Steve Perry. When Perry joined Journey in 1977, he didn't just elevate the band, he rewrote the emotional language of rock music. His voice was pure control and pure vulnerability, delivered in the same breath. High, soaring notes that never cracked, phrasing that felt like confession, and a tone so smooth it felt almost unreal. It wasn't loudness that made him great. It was how he made people feel. Rock wasn't just tough anymore. It was human, and it hit audiences like a tidal wave. Journey didn't just rise, they exploded. Lights, Wheel in the Sky, Lovin', Touchin', Squeezin', and eventually Open Arms and Faithfully didn't sound like songs. They sounded like memories. They sounded like heartbreak you hadn't even lived yet. Perry brought something to rock that no one had mastered before. Emotional clarity. Every word meant something. Every note carried weight. Crowds weren't just singing along, they were belting their souls out with him. By the early 80s, you couldn't turn on the radio, walk into a bar, or step into a high school dance without hearing Perry's voice somewhere in the background. And it was more than popularity. His voice became the standard, the measuring stick, the impossible bar. Critics didn't say, he's a good singer. They said, that's the voice. And when a voice becomes the voice, every rising singer feels it, whether they admit it or not. Especially if you were a young musician trying to break out during that time. Someone still learning, still shaping who you're going to be, someone looking up at the mountaintop and realizing one man is standing at the very peak. And that's exactly where Jon Bon Jovi was. A teenager playing New Jersey clubs, a kid dreaming of arena lights. A voice is still forming, a singer searching for emotional power and identity. He didn't need to copy Steve Perry. He just needed to understand how a voice could make millions of people feel something at the same time. Because before Jon Bon Jovi became the sound of stadium rock, he was chasing the standards Steve Perry had already set. Jon Bon Jovi enters the game. Jon Bon Jovi didn't come from a major music city. He wasn't born into a record label family, and he didn't have the luxury of fame waiting for him. He came up in New Jersey, where the stages were small, the clubs were loud, and the audiences didn't clap unless you earned it. Jon had fire in him, the kind of confidence that doesn't come from success, but from hunger. He believed he was meant for something bigger, but belief alone wasn't enough. In those early years, Jon's voice was good, even strong, but good voices are everywhere. The industry doesn't reward good, it rewards unforgettable. And that was the part Jon was still searching for. His voice had youth, energy, and charm, but it didn't yet have the depth, the ache, the emotional punch that could stop a crowd. He could sing the notes, but the notes didn't mean anything yet. Meanwhile, on every radio station, Steve Perry's voice was doing exactly what Jon needed to learn, making people feel. The contrast was undeniable. Perry didn't just sing heartbreak. He sounded like he'd lived through it. His voice had maturity, experience, soul. Jon didn't try to imitate him. He paid attention to something deeper, how Perry held a note just long enough to let the emotion land, how he softened a phrase instead of belting every line, how silence, breath, and restraint were part of the performance, not mistakes. Jon started listening differently, not as a fan, but as a student. But while Jon was learning emotionally, the world was beginning to draw comparisons. Radio DJs and journalists started using phrases like, Bon Jovi, the New Jersey kid with shades of Journey's emotional rock sound. A younger voice in the lineage Steve Perry pioneered. These weren't insults. If anything, being compared to the voice was a crown. But to a rising singer trying to prove himself, comparison felt like a ceiling. Jon didn't want to be the next Steve Perry. He wanted to be the first Jon Bon Jovi. And that's when the pressure became real, because it wasn't just about singing well anymore. It was about finding a voice that belonged to him. The tone, the pain, the identity. And he wasn't going to find it by playing small clubs forever. Something needed to shift. Something or someone had to push him over the edge. And that's when Desmond Child walked into the picture. The songwriter who linked their sounds. Jon Bon Jovi didn't find his voice alone. Every great artist has a turning point, a person, a moment, an influence that shifts everything. For Jon, that person was Desmond Child. When Jon met Desmond in the mid-1980s, Bon Jovi was on the edge of breaking through, but they didn't yet have the songs that could lift them beyond radio rotation and into arena history. Desmond Child wasn't just a songwriter, he was a strategist. He understood how to take raw emotion and turn it into something that millions could sing at the top of their lungs. And the first thing he did with Jon wasn't to change him, it was to reveal him. Because Desmond heard something others missed. Jon's voice wasn't meant to be smooth. It wasn't meant to glide. It was meant to burn. Where Steve Perry's voice soared like a prayer rising up, Jon's voice hit like a fist on a bar table. Real, urgent, working class, alive. And Desmond leaned into that. He didn't want Jon to chase emotional perfection. He wanted him to chase emotional truth. And in the studio, that meant creating songs that felt like the world Jon came from. Hard jobs, hard love, hard hope. That's how songs like You Give Love a Bad Name, Livin' on a Prayer, and later Bad Medicine came to life. Not as polished anthems designed to be hits, but as stories people actually recognized themselves in. Tommy and Gina weren't characters. They were every couple who ever believed that love and grit were sometimes all you had. And Jon sang it the way only he could, with a voice that wasn't trying to be beautiful, a voice that was trying to survive. But here's where the world of Jon Bon Jovi and Steve Perry quietly connected. Years later, long after Bon Jovi's rise, Desmond Child would work with Steve Perry himself on Perry's solo material, including the track You Better Wait. It wasn't during Journey's heyday. It was during Steve Perry's re-emergence when he was defining his voice again. It was proof of something powerful. Steve Perry and Jon Bon Jovi were never in competition. They were two artists shaped by the same emotional architect, but in completely different ways. One learned to fly, the other learned to fight. And Jon's real transformation was still ahead of him. When Jon found his own voice. By the time Bon Jovi released Slippery, when Wet in 1986, something had begun to shift, not just in the band's success, but in Jon's voice itself. In the studio, his tone still carried clarity and brightness. But once the band hit the road, night after night, something new began to emerge. Something raw, grainy, and alive. And it wasn't planned. The band was touring relentlessly. Cities blurred together. Sleep was optional. Stages were loud. Crowds were louder. Jon wasn't just performing songs. He was pushing through them, shouting over thousands of screaming voices, driving every chorus to the edge of what his chords could handle. And when you live like that, your voice changes, whether you intend for it to or not. Jon's rasp didn't come from imitation or stylistic decision. It came from life. Where Steve Perry's voice stayed smooth, trained, and carefully protected, Jon's voice began to take on the sound of the world he was actually living in. The grit, the wear, the exhaustion, the adrenaline. It all settled into the sound, and the songs transformed with it. Livin' on a Prayer didn't sound polished, it sounded urgent. Wanted Dead or Alive didn't sound theatrical, it sounded true. It was the voice of a man who wasn't just singing about the road, he was surviving it. This is when Jon stepped out of the shadow of comparisons. Not because critics stopped comparing him to Steve Perry, some never did, but because the audience stopped needing the comparison. Steve Perry moved people by lifting them up. Jon Bon Jovi moved people by pulling them forward, and the world responded. Bon Jovi wasn't just a band anymore. Bon Jovi was a movement. But there was a cost to singing with that much force, night after night. By the early 1990s, particularly after the New Jersey and These Days tours, Jon began to feel the physical consequences of years of pushing his voice to its limits. His chords were strained, the high notes were harder. The rasp, once emotional, sometimes turned into damage. Jon didn't hide it, he adapted. He learned new technique. He changed how he breathed. He worked with vocal coaches. He evolved, not to sound like anyone else, but to keep sounding like himself. This was the moment Jon Bon Jovi stopped chasing any standard, even subconsciously, and became the voice no one else could imitate. The price Jon paid for that sound. The voice that made Jon Bon Jovi a global rock icon didn't arrive freely, and it didn't stay unchanged. By the early 1990s, after the massive Slippery When, Wet in New Jersey tours, Jon was performing nearly every night, often for hours at a time, without real rest. The arenas were bigger, the crowds were louder, the pressure was heavier, and the expectation was always the same: hit every note, deliver every show, never break. But no voice is built for that forever. Touring is brutal on the human body, but it's even harder on a singer's instrument, because the instrument is flesh, muscle, tendon, tissue, all pushed to their limit every single night. And Jon wasn't a cautious performer. He didn't hold back. He didn't pace himself. He left everything on the stage, and the voice that once felt limitless finally began to show signs of wear. The rasp that had once felt emotional and organic now faltered in places. High notes took more effort. Some songs needed to be lowered. Fans didn't always notice at first, but Jon did. He could feel it. This wasn't about talent anymore. It was about survival. But Jon didn't fold. He adapted. He began working with vocal coaches who specialized in longevity and breath support, something many rock singers only learn after the damage has already begun. He relearned how to place his voice, how to support tone without pushing from the throat, how to sing with the body, not against it. And he learned something deeper. Just because your voice changes doesn't mean you've lost it. It means it's growing with you. Steve Perry experienced his own vocal challenges years later, also from years of intense emotional performance, proving that even the greatest voices are human. But their journeys weren't parallel struggles. They were shared truths about what it costs to sing with your whole being. Jon didn't give up the rasp. He learned to control it. He didn't fight to sound young again. He learned to sound real. Because the voice that once made him rise was no longer just about power. It was about presence, honesty, and connection. And that evolution led him to do something even more important than sounding perfect. He became undeniably himself. Full circle respect. By the time Jon Bon Jovi had fully stepped into his identity as one of rock's defining voices, the comparisons that once followed him began to fade. Not because people stopped talking, but because Jon's music had become woven into the fabric of a generation. He didn't just have hits, he had anthems. Songs that echoed through stadiums, car radios, bedroom walls, and memories. Meanwhile, Steve Perry's legacy remained untouched. Even during periods of distance from the public eye, the impact of his voice never weakened. His performances didn't just stand the test of time. They became benchmarks other performances were measured against. The world didn't forget the voice. If anything, his absence made his legend even larger. But here is where the story separates itself from every rivalry narrative in music history. There was never a rivalry, no competition, no bitterness, no distance fueled by insecurity, just respect. Jon Bon Jovi never denied Steve Perry's influence. He never pretended he didn't look up to him. He spoke openly and proudly about admiring the way Perry could make a crowd feel without raising his volume or changing his stance. He admired the emotional courage of Perry's voice, not just the technical ability. And Steve Perry, when asked about Bon Jovi, he did not dismiss him, critique him, or diminish him. Instead, Perry acknowledged something that matters far more than vocal similarity or stylistic comparison: longevity, connection, impact. Because the true test of a voice is not how high it can go. It's how long it can stay in the world. Steve Perry's voice became the soundtrack of epic emotion. Jon Bon Jovi's voice became the voice of resilience, of everyday fight, of American grit. And then they stood on different mountains, but they could still see each other clearly. Influence is not imitation, and admiration is not weakness. Sometimes, becoming great means starting by learning from someone who already is. Jon didn't escape Steve Perry's shadow. He built his own light. He didn't break free from the influence, he broke free through it. And in the end, both men became something more powerful than icons. They became voices that defined how entire generations learned to feel. In the end, Jon Bon Jovi didn't try to replace Steve Perry. He learned from him, grew past comparison, and became a voice the world would never forget. Two legends, two eras, one shared legacy of emotion and power in rock. If you want more stories like this, remember, you're watching Backstage Melody, where the music isn't just heard, it's felt. And if you'd like to own a piece of this story, I've linked Steve Perry and Bon Jovi vinyl records below. They're some of the best ways to experience these voices the way they were meant to be heard. Warm, real, and alive on vinyl. Check the links in the description, hit subscribe, and stay with us for the next chapter.